What would you do if in the heart of a frozen town square you saw a man in chains condemned as a thief branded a savage while the crowd cheered his downfall? Would you turn away in silence or risk everything to declare I see a man worth saving? The wind was a blade against my face, carrying needles of ice that found every gap in the worn wool of my scarf. Winter had clenched its fist around our valley early this year, burying the world in a shroud of white and silencing it under a blanket of cold. For 3 years since the fever had stolen Arthur from our bed and left me a widow in a house too large for one soul, the silence had been my constant companion. Now the snow only amplified it, pressing down with a weight that mirrored the one in my own chest. The town of redemption, if you could call it that, was huddled against the cold. Smoke curled from every chimney, a forest of gray ghosts rising into a pewter sky. Usually I avoided town, preferring the solitude of my failing ranch to the pitying glances and whispered condolences that still followed me like my own shadow. But my supplies were dangerously low, and the thought of being snowed in with nothing but dried beans and memories was a bleakness I couldn't yet face. That's why I found myself standing at the edge of the town square, my feet slowly going numb inside my boots. It wasn't the cold that held me there, but the spectacle at its center. A crowd had gathered, their breath pluming in the frigid air, their faces a mixture of grim curiosity and cruel anticipation. Marshal Thorne stood on the steps of his office, his heavy coat making him look like a bear reared up on its hind legs. Beside him, bound in heavy iron chains at the wrists and ankles, stood a man. He was native, that was clear from his high cheekbones, the bronze of his skin, and the straight fall of his night-black hair unbound and dusted with snowflakes. He was tall and built with a lean strength that even the biting cold and the humiliation of his circumstances could not diminish. He wore only thin trousers and a torn shirt that did little to ward off the chill. Yet he stood straighter than any man in that self-righteous crowd. His eyes, dark and deep, swept over them, not with hatred or fear, but with a calm, unnerving dignity. He was a king surveying a rabble. "Gather round, folks," Marshal Thorne's voice boomed, cracking the frozen silence. "Caught this one red-handed trying to make off with horses from the Croft Ranch. Judge says he's to be sold, his labor to pay for the damages and his keep." A low murmur rippled through the onlookers. "Savage," someone spat the word ugly in the clean cold air. "Beast," another added. The words were stones thrown at a statue. He didn't flinch. $50, Thorne began playing the auctioneer. "Who'll give me 50 for a strong back? He can break horses, work a mine. Lord knows his kind are tough as old leather." The air was thick with greed and prejudice. I saw Silas Croft at the edge of the crowd, a smug look on his prosperous face. He owned the biggest ranch in the valley, and had been circling my land like a vulture since Arthur died, making offers that felt more like threats. It was his horses, his accusation, that had brought this man to this wretched state. I should have turned away. I should have gone to the general store, bought my flour and coffee, and retreated back to the cold comfort of my home. But I couldn't move. I looked at the man in chains, the raw red chafe marks on his wrists, where the iron bit into his flesh the way a snowflake melted on his dark hair. And I didn't see a savage. I saw the same defiant strength I had seen in Arthur's eyes as he fought the fever, a refusal to be broken even when the body was failing. I saw a loneliness that echoed my own. A man near the front, one of Croft's hands, bid 50. Another raised it to 60. They were bidding on a human being as if he were a mule. My stomach turned. The injustice of it was a physical sickness, a hot bile rising in my throat. Before I even knew what I was doing, my voice, thin but clear in the winter air, cut through the bidding. "Don't hurt him." Head swiveled in my direction. A path cleared as if by magic, the townsfolk parting to stare at the quiet widow from the Vance Ranch. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me, sharp and critical. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. I met Marshal Thorne's astonished gaze. "I'll buy him," I declared, my voice stronger, this time fueled by a recklessness I hadn't felt in years. A shocked silence fell over the square, so profound I could hear the soft hiss of falling snow. Silas Croft's smug expression curdled into a scowl. Thorne recovered first, a condescending smile touching his lips. "Now, Eleanor, this ain't a stray dog you're taking in. This is a dangerous man. The judge said he was to be sold," I countered, my chin lifting. "I have the money. My money is as good as anyone else's." I reached into my worn reticule, my fingers trembling as I pulled out the small, heavy pouch. It was the last of the emergency money Arthur and I had saved, tucked away for a harsh winter or a sick cow. It was everything I had left. $100, I said the words, tasting of madness and finality. The crowd erupted. "Eleanor, have you lost your mind?" It was Prudence Gable, the banker's wife, her face a mask of horror. "You can't bring that thing home with you. He's a thief," someone else shouted. "A savage." My gaze locked with the man in chains. For the first time, a flicker of something moved in his dark eyes. Surprise. Disbelief. "Call him what you will," I said, my voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even me. "I see a man worth saving." Thorne looked from me to the pouch in my hand, then to the disapproving faces of the town's leading citizens. He was a man who prized order above all, and I had just thrown his predictable world into chaos. But the law, as he was so fond of saying, was the law. A sale was a sale. "Fine," he grumbled, striding over to snatch the pouch from my hand. He counted the coins with deliberate slowness, as if hoping to find me short. When the count proved true, his scowl deepened. "The bill of sale will be ready at my office. You can collect him then." "I'll take him now," I said, standing my ground. "Now see here, Eleanor, I've paid for him, Marshal. By your own words, his labor is now mine. Or do you mean to hold my property illegally?" The veiled threat of involving the circuit judge, a man who had no patience for small-town power plays, was enough. With a sigh of profound irritation, Thorne pulled a key from his pocket and unlocked the man's ankle chains. They fell into the snow with a dull thud. He left the wrist manacles in place. "The rest come off when I have the bill of sale in my hand," I stated, leaving no room for argument. I turned to the man, my voice softer than it had been in years. "Come with me." He studied my face for a long moment, a silent, intense scrutiny that felt as if he were weighing my very soul. Then, with that same unshakable dignity, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. As I led him away from the auction block, the crowd parted before us like a sullen sea. Their faces were a gallery of disgust, shock, and moral outrage. I could feel their judgment like a physical blow, but I kept my head high. We walked in silence toward the marshal's office, the only sounds the crunch of our boots in the snow and the soft clink of the chains that still bound his hands. I risked a glance at him. Up close, I could see the fine lines of hardship etched around his eyes and mouth. He was younger than I had first thought, perhaps my own age. The weariness in his face was not of years, but of a hard-lived life. "My name is Eleanor Vance," I said quietly, not expecting a reply. He looked at me, then a direct and piercing gaze. For a moment I saw past the weary warrior to the man within, and I felt a pang of connection so sharp it almost stole my breath. He gave another small nod, acknowledging my words. Inside the marshal's office, the air was warm and smelled of stale coffee and damp wool. Thorne was scratching out the document with a pen that seemed to voice his displeasure with every stroke. He handed it to me without a word. "The key, Marshal," I prompted. He tossed it onto the desk with a snort of contempt. "Don't come crying to me when he murders you in your sleep for your last biscuit. The only murders in this valley have been committed by so-called civilized men in drunken brawls," I retorted, my patience gone. "Good day, Marshal." Outside in the biting wind, I stopped and faced him. "I am going to take these off now," I said, holding up the key. "I won't keep a man in chains on my property." He held out his wrists, his eyes never leaving my face. The lock was cold and stiff, but it turned with a rusty groan. The manacles fell away, landing silently in a drift of snow. He rubbed his wrists, the first unguardedly human gesture I'd seen from him. The skin was raw and bleeding. "We need to tend to those," I said, my voice tight. "I have salve at the ranch." I paused. "It's a long ride. Can you ride a horse?" The ghost of a smile touched his lips, a fleeting, startlingly beautiful thing. He nodded. The journey back to the ranch was a silent pilgrimage. I had rented a steady old mare from the livery, and he rode her with an easy grace that suggested he was more at home in a saddle than on his own 2 feet. The snow began to fall again, fat, wet flakes that clung to our coats and melted on our faces. The world grew quiet and close, just the two of us moving through a landscape of white and gray. I stole glances at him, this man whose fate I had so impulsively tied to my own. What had I done? The enormity of it settled on me. I had spent every last cent I had. I had made an enemy of the most powerful man in the valley and alienated the entire town. And I had brought a complete stranger, a man convicted of thievery, into my home. It was madness. Yet as I looked at him riding beside me, his back straight against the falling snow, his gaze fixed on the path ahead, I did not feel regret. I felt something else. Something I hadn't felt since Arthur's death, a flicker of purpose. When we finally crested the last hill, the ranch came into view. Even softened by a fresh layer of snow, it looked forlorn. The house sagged, the fences were broken, and the barn leaned as if weary of its long fight against gravity. This was the dream Arthur and I had poured our lives into, now weathered and worn much like myself. I felt a familiar pang of shame waiting for the judgment in his eyes. He surveyed the scene, his gaze taking in every broken board and snow-laden roof. He said nothing, simply gave a slow nod as if he'd seen far worse. Inside the house was cold. I knelt at the hearth and coaxed a fire to life, the flames slowly pushing back the gloom. The small room was sparse but clean, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, and a mantelpiece holding a single silver-framed photograph of Arthur, his smile forever young and full of hope. "You can sleep in the barn," I said, my voice sounding harsh in the quiet room. "There's hay in the loft. I'll bring you blankets and some supper." He stood by the door, a silent, imposing figure. When I turned, I found him looking at the photograph on the mantel. "My husband," I said, the words catching in my throat. "Arthur. He died 3 winters ago." The man nodded, his gaze gentle. He moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at me. His lips moved, shaping an unfamiliar word. He tried again, his voice a low, rough sound, rusty from disuse. "Kalen," he said. He touched his chest. "My name. Kalen." Then he was gone, leaving me alone with the crackling fire and the echo of his name. My heart, which I had thought frozen solid, beat a strange and unsteady rhythm against my ribs. That night I lay awake, listening to the wind howl around the corners of the house, a lonely and mournful sound. But for the first time in 3 years, it wasn't the only sound. Underneath the wind's cry, there was the subtle awareness of another presence on my land. A man named Kalen was sleeping in my barn. The town expected me to be terrified. By all logic, I should have been. Instead, as I drifted into an uneasy sleep, I felt a strange and fragile sense of peace. The silence had been broken. The next morning, the world was pristine and white. I awoke with a list of chores already forming in my mind, a familiar litany of repairs that all felt equally urgent and equally impossible. The roof leaked over the pantry. The well pump handle was loose. The fence of the north pasture was down in 3 places. It was an endless losing battle against decay. A soft knock at the door startled me. Kalen stood on the porch, his dark hair damp with melted snow. He gestured toward the barn, then to himself, and then made a motion of swinging a hammer. "You want to work?" I asked, surprised. He nodded. "I can't pay you," I said quickly, a flush rising in my cheeks. "I spent everything I had yesterday. Food and shelter, that's all I can offer." He held up his hands, showing me the raw, chafed skin of his wrists. Then he pointed to the house to me and nodded again. The meaning was unmistakable. I had freed him. In his eyes, that was payment. I found myself blinking back, a sudden hot sting of tears. "All right then," I managed, my voice thick. "Let's get started." I led him to the tool shed. Arthur's tools hung on the walls just where he had left them, coated in a thin layer of dust and rust. Kalen examined each one with a reverence that touched me. He tested the edge of an axe, the heft of a hammer, the set of a saw. His hands, though marked by the shackles, were knowing and capable. He ran a thumb over the blade of Arthur's favorite handsaw and looked at me. "Your man," he said, his voice still rough. "Good tools." He was particular, I whispered. He always said a man was only as good as the tools he worked with. Kalen considered this, then gave a solemn nod. Wise man. Soon the crisp winter air was filled with the rhythmic sound of a hammer striking true. He had started on the fence, and with an efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch, he began to bring order out of chaos. Posts were straightened, rails were mended. He moved with a fluid economy of motion, wasting nothing. I brought him hot coffee at midday. He drank it gratefully, his dark eyes scanning the property, his mind clearly already planning the next repair. He was not just working. He was assessing, strategizing. He was breathing life back into the dying skeleton of my home. That evening I insisted he eat at the kitchen table. The silence between us was no longer tense but companionable. I found myself talking, the words spilling out of me as if a dam had broken. I told him about Arthur, about our dream of raising horses, about the plans that had turned to dust. He listened without interruption, his attention absolute. When I finally fell silent, embarrassed by my own outburst, he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered land, bathed in moonlight. "Land waits," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "Remembers sorrow, remembers joy, waits for hands that know, for hearts that stay." His words, so simple and profound, settled in my soul. Days turned into a week, then 2. A new rhythm established itself on the ranch. Kalen worked from dawn until dusk with a tireless determination, mending, fixing, rebuilding. The leaky roof was patched. The well pump was secured. The barn door no longer hung at a drunken angle. He moved with a purpose that shamed my own years of weary resignation. In the evenings, he would teach me. He showed me how to read the signs of an approaching storm in the clouds, how to track a rabbit in the snow. In return, I helped him with his English reading aloud from Arthur's small collection of books. I learned his full name was Caelan Stone, and that he came from a tribe far to the south, a people scattered and broken by treaties and soldiers. He spoke little of his past, but in the silences, I sensed a landscape of loss as vast and desolate as my own. The town, of course, watched and whispered. When I made my necessary trips to the store, conversations would cease. Women I had known my whole life would cross the street to avoid me. Only young Ethan Hayes, the doctor's son, would offer a hesitant smile and sometimes slip an extra apple into my sack of flour when his father wasn't looking. "They're saying things, Mrs. Vance," he warned me one day, his young face troubled. "Ugly things. Silas Croft has been stirring them up." "Let them talk," I said, though my heart grew cold. "I know the truth. Just be careful. Some of the men, they talk about riding out to your place to check on you." The unspoken threat was clear. That night, I took Arthur's shotgun from its place above the mantel, cleaned it, and loaded it with hands that trembled only slightly. The next morning, when Caelan saw it leaning by the door, he said nothing, but his eyes met mine in a moment of grim understanding. He understood the danger I had placed myself in for his sake. That day, he worked closer to the house. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. I was chopping wood when I heard the sound of approaching horses. 4 riders. Silas Croft was in the lead, flanked by 2 of his brutish ranch hands, and to my dismay, Marshall Thorne. Eleanor Croft called out, his voice oozing false concern as he dismounted. "We came to see to your welfare. A woman all alone out here with him." His eyes flickered with contempt toward Caelan, who had emerged from the barn and now stood silently by my side, a heavy axe held loosely in his hand. "As you can see, Mr. Croft, I am perfectly well," I said, my voice as cold as the air. "This land is not for sale," I said flatly. "Everything's for sale, Eleanor," he sneered. "It's just a matter of price. Perhaps if you weren't so distracted by your company, you'd see the wisdom in my offer." "Get off my property," I said, my voice low and shaking with rage. Croft took a step forward, his hand dropping to the pistol on his hip. In a flash, Caelan moved, placing himself between me and Croft. He didn't raise the axe, didn't speak a word, but his stance was an unbreachable wall. The air crackled with tension. Marshall Thorne, looking deeply uncomfortable, finally intervened. "The lady asked you to leave, Croft. Let's go." Croft hesitated, his eyes locked with Caelan's. Finally, with a snarl, he turned and remounted his horse. "This isn't over, Eleanor," he spat. "When that savage finally shows his true colors, and he will, don't you come crying to the good people of this town for help." They rode away, leaving a trail of threats hanging in the frozen air. My legs suddenly felt weak, and I leaned against the woodpile for support. Caelan was instantly at my side, a steadying hand on my arm. "Thank you," I whispered. He shook his head, his dark eyes fierce. "You stand for me," he said simply. "I stand for you." That night the cold deepened. The wind shrieked and the snow fell so thick and fast it erased the world. I couldn't send him back to the barn, not in that blizzard. "There's a small room," I said, my voice barely audible over the storm. "Off the kitchen. It's empty. You should stay in the house." He looked at me, a long, searching look. Then he nodded. That night, as the blizzard raged outside, we were 2 souls sheltered under one roof. The silence in the house was no longer one of emptiness, but of shared sanctuary, and in his small room, Caelan Stone lay awake, listening to the storm, guarding the woman who had seen a man worth saving and vowing that her faith would not be in vain. The journey from town had been a silent one, marked only by the creak of saddle leather and the soft thud of hooves on the snow-covered road. I found myself stealing glances at the man beside me, this Caelan Stone, trying to decipher the unreadable landscape of his face. He sat the old mare with an innate poise, his back a straight, defiant line against the oppressive gray sky. His dark eyes were never still, constantly scanning the white-draped hills with a watchfulness that spoke of a life lived on the edge of danger. As we rode, I talked. The words tumbled out of me, a nervous torrent to fill the vast silence between us. I pointed out the ridge that marked my western boundary, the one I'd had to sell a piece of last winter to pay the taxes. I showed him the stand of snow-laden oaks, where Arthur had asked me to be his wife, my voice catching on his name. Caelan listened without comment, but his attention was a tangible thing, a warm weight in the frigid air. It had been so long since anyone had truly listened. When we finally crested the last rise and my ranch lay before us, the familiar mix of shame and stubborn pride churned in my gut. The snow was a merciful blanket hiding the worst of the decay, but it couldn't hide the sagging fence lines or the barn's patched roof. It's not much, I said, the word's a weak defense. It needs more work than one person can manage. Kalen surveyed it all, his sharp eyes missing nothing. Then he gave a single decisive nod. Good bones, he said, his voice a low rumble. Land wants to live, just needs... He made a gesture with his hands, a slow, nurturing motion. Care, I supplied. Yes, care. As we approached the front gate, Kalen suddenly went rigid in his saddle, his hand instinctively dropping to his side where a weapon would have hung. What is it? I asked, my own body tensing in response. He pointed to a set of tracks in the snow, partially obscured by the new fall. 3 horses. Fresh. My heart sank. Visitors, I said grimly. And I can guess who. Rounding the barn, my fears were confirmed. 3 horses were tethered to my porch rail, their riders lounging on the steps as if they owned the place. Silas Croft, flanked by 2 of his thuggish ranch hands. Afternoon, Eleanor Croft, said, his voice a slick veneer of courtesy over a core of malice. He was a big man, made bigger by his thick winter coat, his cold eyes always calculating. Heard about your purchase. Came to make sure you hadn't taken a complete leave of your senses. My mind is my own, thank you, I said, my voice tight. Kalen had dismounted and stood beside me perfectly still, but I could feel the tension radiating from him. He was a coiled spring. His name is Kalen, I said the words, sharp as ice shards, and he is here as a hired hand. Unless you're offering to mend my fences, Mr. Croft, I'll thank you to mind your own affairs. Croft's face flushed a dull, angry red. Now see here, Eleanor, I've been patient, but if you're going to endanger the whole community with this foolishness, the only danger here, I interrupted, my temper flaring, is from uninvited men who trespass on a woman's property. One of his men snickered. Folks are talking, ma'am. Saying things ain't proper. My anger, cold and clean, finally boiled over. Then perhaps they should spend less time gossiping and more time reading their Bibles, particularly the parts about loving thy neighbor. Croft took a step toward me, his hand resting on his gun. Instantly, Kalen was there, moving between us. He was a silent, unbreachable wall of quiet menace. You threatening me, boy? Croft snarled. Kalen remained silent, his gaze unwavering. That's enough, I said, stepping around Kalen to face Croft directly. You need to leave. Now. This isn't over, Croft warned, his eyes glittering with malice. When that savage shows his true colors, you'll come begging for help. Get off my land, I repeated, my voice a low whisper that held more threat than a shout. After they had ridden off, a violent tremor ran through me. Kalen guided me to the porch steps, his touch surprisingly gentle. He drew a bucket of fresh cold water from the well and brought me a cup. Thank you, I managed, my hands shaking. He crouched before me, his dark eyes filled with a concern that was deeply unsettling and profoundly comforting. This trouble. Because of me, he said, the words costing him. I go. Trouble goes. The word burst from me, fierce and absolute. No, I repeated more softly. The trouble was here long before you. You're just his latest excuse. He considered this, then asked the question that hung in the air between us. Why? Why do this, buy freedom for a stranger? I looked down at my hands, at the rough, callous skin that spoke of years of hard work. When I saw you there, being sold, I thought about how helpless I felt when my husband was dying. There was nothing I could do but watch. I couldn't save him. I met Kalen's eyes, my own burning with unshed tears. But I could save you. Does that make any sense at all? He held my gaze for a long moment, then gave a slow, solemn nod. Yes, he said. It makes all the sense in the world. That evening, as I prepared a simple stew and Kalen tended to the horses, the ranch felt different. The oppressive silence I had lived with for 3 years had been replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. We were 2 solitary souls thrown together by circumstance, standing against a hostile world. It was a fragile alliance, but it was something. We ate at the kitchen table. I watched him, the careful way he ate, the way he savored each bite. When our eyes met, he inclined his head in a gesture of gratitude that needed no words. We'll need more supplies, I said, thinking aloud. Nails, some lumber, new leather for the pump. I trailed off the reality of my empty purse crashing down on me. Kalen reached into a hidden pocket in his worn trousers and placed a small leather pouch on the table. When I opened it, several silver coins gleamed in the lamplight. Before he said simply, hidden, they did not find. I can't take your money. He pushed the pouch firmly toward me. For the ranch, he said. For us. Us. The word hung in the quiet kitchen, a small warm ember. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. That night I paused by my window before banking the fire. A soft light glowed from the barn. Kalen had lit the lantern I'd left for him. For the first time in 3 long years, I wasn't alone. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, tomorrow felt like something to look forward to rather than something to be endured. The morning was so cold, the air felt brittle, like it might shatter. I found Kalen already at work, his breath misting as he split firewood with a powerful rhythmic grace. His shirt was off despite the chill, and the muscles in his back coiled and released under skin that was still mapped with the faint, fading bruises from his ordeal in town. "You'll catch your death," I said, handing him a steaming mug of coffee. He paused, accepting the mug with a nod. "Work warms the blood." We stood in a comfortable silence, sipping the hot coffee as the sun crested the eastern ridge, setting the snow-covered world ablaze with a cold white fire. Today, Kalen stated more than asked we fix the north fence. That would be good, I agreed, a familiar ache settling in my chest. Arthur always said a ranch is only as sound as its fences. The mention of his name was a ghost on my lips. Kalen studied me, his gaze thoughtful. "You know other things," he said. "The house, the garden in summer, the animals." He gestured around us. "Takes 2 kinds of strength to make a home." His understanding was so simple, so direct, it caught me off guard. I felt that now familiar sting of tears and turned away to hide them. We worked together all morning, a silent, efficient team. He dug the post holes in the frozen ground with a strength that seemed impossible while I wrestled the new posts into place. We fell into a rhythm, an unspoken language of shared labor. In the thin winter sun, under the vast indifferent sky, we were 2 people, rebuilding not just a fence but a world. When we stopped for a meager lunch of cold biscuits and water, I watched a lone hawk circling high above. "My father," Kalen said suddenly, his voice pulling me from my thoughts. "He would have liked this land. He said land that can support pine and cedar has a strong spirit." "Was he?" I asked carefully. A shadow passed over his face. "Gone. Many winters now." "The soldiers." He fell silent, the word hanging in the air, heavy with unspoken history. "They said we had to move." My father said no. This was the land of our ancestors. The soldiers did not like to be told no. I reached out my gloved hand, covering his where it rested on a log. "I'm sorry, Kalen." He looked down at my hand, then up at my face, his expression unreadable. "You have a soft heart, Eleanor Vance," he said quietly. "Perhaps too soft for this world," I admitted. By late afternoon, a long stretch of fence stood straight and true against the snow. A surge of pride, fierce and unfamiliar, rose in me. It had been so long since anything on this ranch had been mended instead of broken. As we were gathering the tools, Kalen suddenly went still, his head cocked toward the road. I listened, and soon I heard it too, the steady rhythm of a lone rider. It was young Ethan Hayes from town. "Mrs. Vance," he called out, reining in his horse. He glanced nervously at Kalen, but managed a polite nod. "A letter for you. Came on the stage yesterday." He handed it to me, then hesitated. "There's more talk, ma'am," he said in a low voice. "Croft is fanning the flames, saying things. Be careful." After he'd gone, I stared at the letter. The return address was Chicago. My sister Margaret. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal. "Dearest Eleanor," the letter began. "Word has reached us of your scandalous actions. I cannot express our shock. To take a savage into your home. Have you lost your senses entirely? Mother is beside herself. I implore you, sell that wretched failing ranch and come home where you belong. Think of Arthur's memory. What would he say to see you consorting with a heathen?" I crumpled the letter in my fist, a white-hot rage burning away my grief. Samuel watched me, his face a mask of quiet concern. "My sister," I said, my voice shaking. "She thinks I have shamed my husband's memory. She wants me to sell this place and go back to pouring tea and wearing black for the rest of my days." He held my gaze. "You want this?" "No." The word ripped from my throat. "This is my home. Arthur and I built this. I will not abandon it because it's hard, or because I'm alone, or because they disapprove. Not alone now," Kalen said, his voice a quiet anchor in my storm. I looked at him standing there against the vast cold landscape, his face smudged with dirt from our shared labor, and the rage inside me softened, replaced by a fierce protective loyalty. "No," I agreed, my voice dropping. "Not alone." That evening, as the aroma of rabbit stew filled the small kitchen, I found myself telling him about the good times with Arthur. The memory was a dull ache instead of a sharp pain. He listened, and then he spoke of his own life before. of learning to hunt from his grandfather, of a world of spirits and stories that seemed as distant as another star. The mission school, he said, his face hardening at some unseen memory. They took us from our families, cut our hair, forbade our tongue. They beat us for speaking the words of our mothers. He touched his chest. They tried to kill the Indian to save the man, but they cannot kill what lives here. Good, I said fiercely. Don't ever let them. Our lives settled into a new pattern dictated by the demands of winter and the needs of the ranch. The days were filled with hard, satisfying work. The evenings were for shared meals and quiet conversations by the fire. The ranch began to heal, and so I realized it. One afternoon I heard him singing in the barn. The melody was haunting, ancient, sung in a language I didn't understand. I stood frozen, listening as the strange, beautiful sound washed over me. When he finished, he saw me watching from the barn door. That was beautiful, I said. What was it? A song for the horses, he said, looking almost shy. My grandfather's song. It calms them. Will you teach me? He looked surprised. You want to learn? Yes. And so my lessons began. Simple words at first. Mina for water, Tanka for sky, Maka for earth. He was a patient teacher. In return, I taught him to read the words he spoke so well. One evening, weeks after his arrival, we sat on the porch wrapped in blankets against the cold. Our ranch looked better than it had in years. Thank you, Kaylin, I said suddenly. For all of this, I couldn't have done it alone. You gave me freedom, he said simply. I give you my hands. A fair trade. Is that all this is to you? A trade? The question hung between us. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars begin to prick the darkening sky. No, he said, his voice low. Not just a trade. You saw me. When others saw a beast, you saw a man. That is a gift greater than freedom. I felt the now familiar burn of tears. Without thinking, I reached over and took his hand. His fingers, rough and calloused from work, closed gently around mine. We sat that way as the world went dark, two lonely people who had found in each other a solace we had stopped looking for. The world beyond our mended fences could threaten and condemn, but here in the cold, quiet dark we had forged something true. A partnership. A friendship. And perhaps, I admitted to the silent watching stars, the fragile beginnings of something more. In this story, what echoes most strongly is the power of compassion and human dignity. When Eleanor dared to say don't hurt him, she not only saved a man but also saved her own heart from loneliness. The lesson for us, especially in later years, is that a soft heart is not weakness. It is a quiet kind of courage, the courage to see the person behind the labels, to extend a hand instead of turning away. Healing flows both ways. When we help someone rise, we rise with them. Life is like the old fence in the field, bent and battered by storms. It doesn't need a miracle. Only steady hands setting one post straight at a time. Never fear beginning again. Even late in life, it is better to mend than to give up. A warm home is built not by grand gestures, but by small faithful fires kept burning. Hold firm against injustice, but leave your door open to kindness. Be steadfast with what is wrong, patient with what is human. And remember, communities can change one act of mercy. One word of fairness can begin to break down prejudice. To live slowly, to do what is right, to love with respect. That is the truest path to peace in our later years. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.